In this video, we're going to talk about the different types of coasts that we have here in America. We have very different shorelines on the east versus the west coast, and this is because they have different geologic properties. We'll see that the east coast is submergent, while the west coast is an emergent coastline. Our east coast shorelines are these nice gently sloping beaches with lots of loose sand. Our west coasts have lots of really steep cliffs and solid rocks and really cold waters. So we're going to see that the different coasts along the U.S. have very different erosion problems. They're different shapes, they're different steepness, and they're made out of different materials. So when we're looking at east versus west coast, our east coast is called a submergent coast, while our west coast is emergent. And here the difference is all in respect to sea level, whether sea level looks like it's rising in the area or if sea level is falling. If it looks like sea level is rising and it's submerging the land, we call this the submergent coast that we see along the east coast, like where we live. But on the other hand, if it looks like sea level is lowering, it's going to look like land is emerging out of the water. And we call this an emergent coast, which is what we see along the west coast of the U.S. Starting off with our submergent coast, again, these are the ones along the east coast of the United States. Here it's going to look like the land is either sinking or the water is rising. So this submergent coast happens when the land itself is sinking or subsiding into the water, or we're seeing that the water is rising and submerging the land around it. But we'll see that there are very specific features to these submergent coasts. And the first is that it has a really irregular shoreline. It's not straight shoreline like we would see farther south here in Florida. But here we see these really irregular estuaries where we have these drowned river mouths. So these estuaries are used to be the very end or the mouth of a river, but as our land has subsided and the water has risen to cover up or submerge the land, it has started moving up the river itself. Because it looks like the land is submerging and it's being lost to the water, the U.S., or at least the east coast of the U.S. along the Atlantic and the Gulf Coast, has some really unique erosional problems. And a lot of these occur around our barrier islands, those islands of just loose sand that are not built on top of solid rock. But there are some issues with our barrier islands because as humans, we love to build on them. We love to build really nice beach homes, as well as hotels, condos, casinos, anything we can. But there are major issues with building on barrier islands because they are just piles of loose sand. That sand is going to move around very easily. With these barrier islands, they're open to the direct ocean. The next time a storm like a hurricane moves through, these barrier islands are going to receive the full strength of the storm before it ever makes landfall. So, due to the fact there is the first part that the storm hits, and the fact that it's just a pile of loose sand, we have major destruction that occurs when storms move through these barrier islands. But now that we're learning more about how complex these barrier islands are, we're trying to better develop them. Instead of building directly on the beach, we're going to build maybe a few blocks back inland. And one of the things that we're currently doing is moving infrastructure farther back from the coast, which we can see in this image, where they've moved this lighthouse back from the coast about 3,000 feet. It cost over $12 million to move less than a mile, and within the next 50 years, this barrier island is going to change so much that they'll have to do this again. Our Pacific coast, on our west coast of the U.S., has very different erosion problems than where we are. Because this is an emergent coast where we see that either the sea level is lowering or the land is rising more out of the water, we're going to see that the coastline here is not gently sloping beaches that are covered in loose sand. Instead, it's mostly really steep cliff faces with very narrow strips of sandy beaches in front of it. One of the major issues with these West Coast beaches, though, is that over time the beach themselves are getting narrower and narrower. So the sandy area we would want to go play near the waves and maybe get a little bit of sun is getting smaller over time. And this is because a lot of rivers along our west coast are dammed. They're holding back water to help preserve water for humans to drink and to create energy, but these dams are also holding sediment behind. So that sediment isn't being deposited on our beaches like it would naturally. And because of this, we're seeing that these beaches are very rapidly eroding. A lot of these coastlines, we might eventually just see those steep cliffs in the mountains and no sandy beaches at all.